So sorry guys, having a little bit of IT issues still. So I was showing you. I wanted to show you where the Ohio River Valley is. So it runs from the Great Lakes down through here and into the Mississippi River. So this area right here, which is west of the Appalachians, is called the Ohio River Valley. So whenever they talk about the Ohio River Valley, they're talking about this area here. Okay. All right, some other things I want you to remember is the population. So 60% of the colonies were English, and you're going to see this in culture, in religion. 20% are German, Irish, and Scots, and 20% were slaves. Take a look at this British in culture. They are Anglican. They are Anglican, meaning that they were Christians from Britain. That if you go back to the Protestant Reformation, you really need to understand that in the 1500s, all over Europe, people were leaving the Catholic Church, and Henry VIII declared himself the leader of the Catholic Church in England. He was trying to get a divorce from his wife, who was a Spanish royalty, and Catherine of Aragon. And so he broke away and created Anglicanism. And pretty much it was to be Anglican was to be not only not Catholic, but to be English. So there was a certain amount of nationality with that too. So remember that. Also, one thing I want you to remember is the 7 Years' War is not the first time that these guys have fought. The French and the English have been traditional enemies for hundreds of years. So this is not the first time. Okay, I already pointed this out about the River Valley, but please remember that the French control the Ohio River Valley, and remember that the British control everything east of the Appalachians. Okay? Also remember that it was during the 7 Years' War that they have their very first Continental Congress. In fact, Benjamin Franklin is going to present what he's called his Albany Plan, which will be unification of all the colonies. They couldn't agree to that, so they didn't do it. But that will kind of lay the foundation, see the first spark of this idea of unification. When I write things down here, it's very important. This is a very important event. So this is what happens during this Albany conference that they're having, talking about, and all they wanted in the 7 Years' War is they're just talking about the issue with the French. And it was during this Albany Congress that the Virginia governor sent Washington to go and to deal with the French who were in the Ohio River Valley. And he goes in and he gets attacked by the French and Native American scouts, and he's defeated. And when this defeat is sent back to Britain, they find out about it, the British declare war on the French. Okay, so that's kind of like the first shot that's fought, that's heard in this battle. Now remember, the 7 Years' War was not just in the Americans, it was a global war. So it was fought in North America, in the Caribbean, in Europe, in South America, in India, and in the Pacific Ocean. So it was fought all over the world. Spain and Germany took sides. So Germany took the sides of the British, and the Spanish took the side of the French, which is traditionally what they do. Okay, at first France is going to win these battles, but eventually the British will be the ones who are successful. At one point, the British or the French got within 60 miles of Philadelphia, and when the British were losing, the American colonists started to question the commitment of the British to protecting them. So we see some resentment building here. Okay. Now, so the British keep losing, and then William Pitt assumed command of wartime operations. William Pitt was actually, at one point, he was a prime minister, and he's going to then kind of like take over the wartime operations, and things will get much better after that. All right. Okay, here's an important moment. So the British are going to take control of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. This will control the French's access to their French colonies, and that will be the end of it for France. Once France can't get to their colonies, that will be the end of it. And in the 7 Years' War, what will happen is that the British will gain so much. So take a look. The British are going to gain all the land all the way through the Ohio River Valley, everything through the Mississippi River, okay? The British will gain control of all of this. The French will really maintain only control of the Rocky Mountains through the Mississippi, and then, of course, the Caribbean they will maintain control of. And the French were really, good thing that the British won, because they were really close to bankruptcy. There wasn't really any money left to fight these wars. So the Native American tribes in the Ohio River, remember, they had a really good relationship with the French, and they were not happy that the British had won. They knew that now that the British controlled their lands, that it would not be good for them. So Chief Pontiac united a bunch of different tribes together, and this is a good place where they might ask you questions. Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Delaware, and they attacked forts, British forts, in the Ohio country and in Pennsylvania. And so now we're going to have to be fighting just the Native Americans after the French leave. This is going to be often be called the Pontiac War, and after Pontiac, of course, is going to lose because of a lack of supplies against the British. But because of that, the British, because they can see that this expansion is going to make the Native Americans restless and make them angry, the British will agree to not allowing expansion for the Americans farther than the Appalachians. So that's the treaty that, of course, those treaties are broken all the time. And this is the Royal Proclamation. So anything that I underline, you should read. So look at yours right now and see if you read about this Royal Proclamation. So it was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It forbade all American settlement of the area west of the Appalachian Mountains. And this severely angered the Americans. So even though many Americans already lived west of the Appalachians, they're being told they cannot, so they are on their own, and they're going to lose money. They're going to lose their lands because they're saying that's for the Native Americans. All right. So most Americans just ignored this proclamation, and they just went about their business settling the Appalachians. And really, the British were really tired of having to protect us. They were sick of sending soldiers. The 7 Years' War, like I said, the British were almost bankrupt. It was an expensive war. And so they were really tired of sending troops here. All right, so let's take a look at the origins of this anger in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts colony is really the one where all the fighting takes place, and they're the most staunch opposition to British, okay? One of the things you want to remember is Massachusetts was a little bit different than the rest of the colonies. They were extremely democratic. The citizens were very involved in the government, and there was a tradition of Puritan resistance. So remember, the Puritans, they were the ones who came to Massachusetts, and they were traditional resistors. They left Britain because they didn't want to be under British control. So you have this cultural tradition of resistance to government, and that's going to be an underlying foundation in the Massachusetts colony. However, there's really insufficient fertile land for people to farm and grow. So a lot of people were very poor in Massachusetts, and a lot of people ended up having to move to cities because they couldn't afford to, in order to make their livelihood. And so we need lots of jobs in these cities. And there was a lot of resentment because the British had 4,000 troops stationed in Massachusetts, and many of these troops did moonlighting jobs. Moonlighting is when you have a day job and then you have a part-time night job also. So they're trying to make some extra money, and so they're taking the jobs of the people who live in the Americas. There was a lot of resentment to the British troops, so they didn't want the troops there anymore. Many of the first people who are complaining are called the Patriots, and we're going to hear them called that again and again, so remember that. And the first leader of the Boston Patriots was this guy, James Otis. So that's somebody you want to remember. And he was one of the first people who termed this taxation without representation. He did not believe that British citizens, they were citizens of Britain, but they did not have representation in Parliament. And so there was no way for them to complain to a representative about any taxation, and Parliament kept taxing the colonists, and he felt like this was not fair as a citizen of the British colony. Some of the first patriots are some of these famous guys, John and Samuel Adams. Of course, John Adams, going to be one of our first presidents. So we have John, remember, he was Harvard educated. He was a lawyer, he was very smart, and he served as an ambassador, whereas in Sam was also a Harvard graduate, but he was less successful. He was better at communicating and building relationships with people. So these two guys are going to be really important. Now this gets us to the taxation without representation issue. We have all of these acts, these stamp acts, and these acts that are going to make the colonists angry. So salutary neglect. This is, so the Stamp Act settled this issue. The British had not been taxing the colonists, and Parliament was very angry that they had spent so much money on this war where they were protecting their colonists, but the colonists hadn't paid anything for it. So they said there's been salutary neglect. You have not been paying your dues. So they passed this act called the Stamp Act, which was a way of getting money from the earliest colonists. And what they did is they said that in order to print any material, it must be printed on British paper. That's what the Stamp Act was. It had to be printed on British stamped paper. So to print anything, it had to have a British stamp on it, and it had to be paid for in British currency. So what this did is allowed them to make some of that money back from that they had paid. I made this little Venn diagram down here to remember the difference between John and Sam Adams. So you might want to remember this. So John was a lawyer. He was in the Continental Congress. He became president. He was also a vice president and well educated. His brother was also well educated. They both went to Harvard, so that's the middle one. But he was more of a political organizer. Here's a stamp. I circle this because I want you to go to the PDF and look at this. It's kind of cool to look at this stamped paper and see what they had to print everything on this. It had to have a stamp on it, okay? The Stamp Act was followed by a couple other acts, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and these were passed to make more money to help pay for the war. The problem is that the colonists could avoid this. These merchants, that instead of going through and paying these tariffs on sugar and all this, that they could go through other ports, and so it was kind of like a black market. They realized that they didn't really have to pay these taxes, so it was kind of like a black market going on. The Stamp Act was paying for the British troops, but the colonists, like I said, they were paying for these British troops, but the colonists believed that because of the Magna Carta, if you don't know what the Magna Carta is, you need to look it up. The Magna Carta was signed in 1215 by King John of England. He was forced to sign it by the nobles, and what it did is it protected the nobles from taxation without representation. It said, in order to tax us, you have to ask. So now we have this law that says that the nobles have to be taxed or asked before they can be taxed. And that was in 1215. Now we're all the way in the 1700s. At this point, it's way more than just the nobles that have to be asked. They actually have a parliament, and they have both the House of Lords, that's where the nobles are, but they also have the House of Commons. And this is for landowners, people who maybe aren't royalty, but they own land. They're farmers. They're the big farmers who have lots and lots of land. They have to be asked too. So there was no representation at all in Parliament. There was not a single representative from the colonies who were in Parliament. There were colonial legislatures that they said, well, why don't you use that and ask them if we can be taxed, okay? So our first Congress that's going to come together after the 7 Years' War is called the Stamp Act Congress. And it's going to be called by Massachusetts. They were the ones who called this. They invite all of the other colonies to come to this Congress. They end up meeting in New York. And Virginia, the governor of Virginia, who's a loyalist, forbids anybody to go to this Congress. So Virginia was not represented there. Okay. And this was really, so the Continental Congress that was created and the Stamp Act Congress are kind of like the same thing. So the Stamp Act Congress that's created here by Massachusetts in New York is going to eventually evolve into the Continental Congress. So remember again, I wrote the Magna Carta down because this is the foundation of the whole thing. And what the colonists say is that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to boycott all British goods until the Stamp Act is repealed. And this is going to be there. And if they're not, remember that Parliament, the largest house is the House of Commons, and the House of Commons is made up of very wealthy landowners who many of them are involved in mercantile business, and if they are losing money because of this, they're going to go ahead and repeal the Stamp Act. Before I move on to this, I want to talk about something really quickly, and that is that land in the Americas was cheap, okay? So many of the colonists could have owned land. You know, it was like there was laws about whether or not you could have representation in Parliament, and you were by a landowner, you were able to have representation. If they passed a law to make it so that the Americans, who are also landowners, would have representation, there would have been so many Americans because so many colonists were landowners. The thing is that they were super cheap to own land in the Americas, so they felt as if economically and socioeconomically they were not equals to the landowners in England. They never would have seen them as equals, and that's one of the reasons why they wouldn't give them a seat in Parliament. Okay? In fact, they argued that the colonists actually had a virtual representation in the House of Commons because the commoners, which aren't really very common, would be looking out for the colonists, which everybody laughed at, and they said that's ridiculous. Okay. So, and this is more about, to remember, aristocrats are in the House of Lords, landowners who are not royalty are in the House of Commons. And so these two houses, take a look at this. I think this is really interesting. You don't need to go to the PDF because you can see it here. But you can see there's lots of propaganda that was made. And this is really funny. It was actually made in Britain by a British company and then sent to the Americas, no Stamp Act, where the Americans would buy up this propaganda. So I think it's really funny that the British industrialists were making money off of this conflict that was going on here, okay? So they're saying they're not going to buy any British goods, right? But of course they're buying the propaganda, all right? So we have here, I've already said about this. Let's look down here at the Declaratory Acts, and this is just Parliament trying to take control of the colonies. They were like trying to assert control. Next act is going to be the Townshend Act, and what they do is that the Townshend Act takes away colonial autonomy, and that it says, it takes away their colonial power, and makes the British Chancellor this exchequatur. I looked this word up. Aisha, you probably know what this word means, but I couldn't figure out what this word means. It means the treasury, the person who controls the treasury, controls the money. And they change, in the Townshend Act, they change it so that all judges are no longer paid by colonial legislatures. All judges now are paid by the British government. So of course this is going to make these judges loyal to the British government, not to the colonies. Why are they doing this? Because they're preparing to arrest anybody who is protesting against the British government, taking them in front of these pro-royalist judges where they will get condemned, and of course the colonists are outraged that they're doing this thing, okay? We then, the colonists then form this commission. It's called the American Board of Customs Commission, and their job was to investigate what's happening with these judges and these trials against these protesters. And they're going to say that smugglers are being condemned for breaking laws in juryless and get convictions without any proof, and that anybody can get convicted. Okay. I want you to look at this. Go to this in the PDF. It's on page 17 to see the color print of the Massachusetts, what's it called? The Boston Massacre. And I want you to really understand the Boston Massacre and what happens here. So the Boston Massacre happens with this. So it was a group of patriots, they were called the Sons of Liberty, who were going to boycott all of these acts, right? And I want to read, whenever I circle something, I want to read the whole thing. So they were a loosely organized secret organization opposed to British policies. The Sons of Liberty used threats and intimidation against the British officials. They destroyed property, burned unpopular figures in effigy, and tarred and feathered tax collectors. I cannot tell you how horrible tarring and feathering was. The people who were tarred and feathered often would die, because when you tar somebody, you have to heat up tar, the stuff that you put on streets, like to make roads. You have to heat it up to the point that it's like liquid, and then they would smear it all over their bodies, and then they would stick feathers to them, and to get that, it would burn you, like 3rd-degree burns, and then to get it off, you would rip your skin off to get it off. So these people would die of these, they get horrible infections. I mean, tarring and feathering was a horrible way to die, okay? So they tar and feather. So these guys were not nice, these Sons of Liberty, okay? The Patriot leaders decried the violent tactics of the Sons of Liberty, but nevertheless, they depended upon their networks to disseminate Patriot arguments. So you have to understand that, like Sam Adams and John Adams and like and Benjamin Franklin, they did not like these Sons of Liberty, but they needed them, so they're willing to put up with their shenanigans. Okay, so. And when I was reading it, I wrote down here, these sound like the Nazis. These guys going around, loosely organized, secret organized, opposed the British policies. They used threats, intimidation against the British officials, destroyed property, burned unpopular figures and effigies, tarred and feathered. I'm like, these sound like the brown shirts walking through streets, beating up their opponents. So I think it's pretty interesting. Okay, nobody wants me to teach American history because I go, that's interesting. Whereas a lot of people would probably say the Sons of Liberty were like heroes. I don't know about that. Okay, so women played a very important role in the American Revolution because they were the big purchasers of goods, and they participated in these boycotts, right? So they refused to buy goods. and really were really the ones who economically supported the American Revolution. So let's take a look at what happens at the Boston Massacre. So it's really was, we have this, John Adams and John Hancock and other elites feared the enthusiasm of these crowds that were led by the Sons of Liberty. They were afraid of them. They're afraid that they would go out of control. But again, like, they needed to give them some room because they could use them. Okay, what happens? Here are the guys who are involved in the Boston Massacre. Sam Gray, he was the owner of a rope making shop. Crispus Attucks, he was a mulatto, which means that he was a mix between a black person and a white person. James Caldwell, a mate of a ship, so he was a ship, on a merchant ship. And then we have Sam Maverick, age 17. He was an apprentice to an ivory worker. And then we have Christopher Monk, age 17. He was apprenticed to a shipwright, so a ship's carpenter. And I looked at this and I'm like, these guys are just like these, look how they're mostly 17 years old. They're like these disgruntled young men, right? I said they're hooligans, okay? And then a lot of the people who lived in Boston were poor. They were disgruntled. They're angry about all this stuff. And we're almost done with this section, and then I'm going to stop the video. And when the Boston Massacre happened, okay, so you know about the Boston Massacre, what happened. So the shot heard around the world. What happens is nobody knows who shot the first shot, but then eventually, the British began shooting. The Sons of Liberty were throwing, snowballs at the soldiers, but some claim that the snowballs had rocks in them. And then somebody heard a shot and everybody starts shooting, and that's what happens. Now, John Adams, he wanted to try and prove to the British that we are sophisticated, we're educated, so he actually defended the soldiers, and he was able to get 4 of them acquitted, and 2 others were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to branding on the thumb. I'm not even sure what that is, but it sounds horrible. Okay, but here is this patriot who defends these guys who were in the Boston Massacre. Okay, so Paul Revere is the one who actually coined the Boston Massacre. We've all heard of Paul Revere's, right? Paul Revere was a really good political cartoonist. He would write, he would depict things that were happening, and then he would deliver stories to other patriots about what was going on to get the information out, okay? All right, the next thing we need to hear about is the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So after the Boston Massacre, there was a repeal of the Townshend Act. It was mostly not because of the Boston Massacre, but mostly because of these women who were refusing to purchase British goods. And however, there was this Tea Act, okay? Let's see here, where is it? Okay. They had a Tea Act that you could only buy tea from the British. So only from the British East India Company is the only way that you could buy tea. You couldn't buy it from any other companies. You couldn't buy it from the French East India Company. You couldn't buy it from the Dutch East India Company, which might have had lower prices, okay? So the British had a monopoly on this. And it talks about, in here, I think this, and it says that they charged 3 pence tax on all the tea. And you have to understand that these colonists were British. I cannot over-explain how important tea was in the British culture, and that's in the American culture because they were British, okay? And of course, because of this, they're going to start protesting tea and refusing to buy the tea, not allowing any tea to be unloaded. And so in Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson was determined to resist the Patriot threats and see the tea safely unloaded into the Boston Harbor. So, patriots organized by the Sons of Liberty moved on to resist on December 16, 1773. 300 men threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This is called the Boston Tea Harbor. Now, it's going to be very soon after that that we start to see these other acts passed. Angered by the destruction of the property in Boston Harbor, Parliament fired back with the coercive acts. By the coercive acts, that if you are protesting, you can be arrested without trial. You can be arrested and put in jail. And this is a direct response to the Boston Tea Party. Also, we get the Port Act. It closed the port of Boston. Said, okay, you want to throw tea in the harbor? Then we'll treat you like babies. Okay? And they told them, you cannot open your harbor, which is one of the most important harbors for the Americans, until you pay for the tea. You must pay the British East India Company for the tea you threw into the harbor. And they were like, no, we're not going to pay for that, right? Okay? And the Parliament even revoked the Massachusetts Charter of 1693, meaning that they were taking the Massachusetts power away from them from even governing themselves. Then we have this justice that allowed the British government to move trials for royal officials and British troops outside. Remember that John Adams defended these guys, and he got 4 acquitted, but 2 of them were convicted. So they're like, we don't want any of our guys convicted. So they said, we're going to move our troops. Anybody who's is going to be on trial for any kind of crime, we're going to move them out of the colonies. And then we have the Quartering Act, and the Quartering Act allows for that the British can house troops in any unoccupied buildings. And this is what one of our amendments to the Constitution is about, right? About not having, that you can't house soldiers in your house. So, like, for instance, what is an unoccupied building? It's like a barn, right? So here they come on and they're like, yeah, so you have an unoccupied building over here and one over here, and you're going to take care of our troops. Oh my gosh. So they're just going to be hanging out by your house. We have also this Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act, actually, what it did was it gave more freedom to the French that the British had just conquered in the 7 Years' War. So it's like they're trying to divide and conquer. They're trying to keep the French who are living in what is now Canada from joining with the Patriots. So they keep the French happy. They're trying to divide and conquer. So the Patriots, so because of the punishment that was put by Parliament upon Massachusetts, a lot of the colonists were really worried about this continued, that these punishments would spread past Massachusetts. And so they decide to hold this First Continental Congress. Ironically, the First Continental Congress was solely to define the colony's relationship with Great Britain. It was not to leave. It was not to revolt. It was not a revolutionary war. The purpose of it was to try and settle the relationship with Britain, maybe even to try and close the wounds that have happened, okay? So it's not going to be till later, of course, that it turns into a war. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop this for now. With all the other videos, it's about an hour that it took to get through this first section. So I will record another hour later.